Here's some archaeological and other circumstantial evidence that may help us understand some of the context for the conflict in the Iliad. To begin with, let's look at the location of Troy, which has been determined by archaeologists beginning in the 19th century, and it lies right at the tip of the arrow there in Asia Minor. And you'll notice that it is very close to this narrow body of water that leads from the Aegean Sea into the Sea of Marmara and thus up into the Black Sea. That means that Troy is controlling access to a major trade route of the period. We know that these cultures are seafaring cultures, that they are primarily involved with trade and occupy sort of the edges of these coastlines. And what it means is that Troy is, by nature of its location, potentially very powerful and also potentially very rich if it levies any kind of control over that trade. That makes it a logical target of opportunity for attack for reasons of greed, if it's a wealthy city, but also just any conflict over trade. Troy is controlling a large chunk of that trade, and therefore is a logical target. So its location alone suggests that the Trojan War had a kind of a logical geopolitical context. The actual discovery of Troy, the archaeological discovery of Troy, is interesting because it gives us a kind of a window into Mycenaean civilization, which is an early version of the Hellenic culture. And here's a little Google map of Troy. It's down at the A there. This guy, Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist, he didn't begin as an archaeologist. He was essentially self-taught. He became a wealthy man. He had always loved the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he felt sure that they described real places and that the Trojan War really happened. So when he got money, he decided he was going to go off and find Troy. And in fact, he did find Troy by looking at various potential sites and digging. As an archaeologist, it was an early period of archaeology, and many of his methods, of course, were highly destructive, and a lot of what's happened to the ancient Troy is parts of it have been destroyed in an attempt to kind of find the right level. He kept digging down to try to find the level of the Troy of the Iliad, which was what he wanted to find. But nonetheless, he made a really important contribution because until that time, the poem was considered to be purely legendary, and he showed that it did have a real context. So we can zoom in here on the Google map, get a little closer. You can see the fields there. We see that Troy occupies a kind of a hilly piece here. It's at the top of a hill. I'll zoom in on that. Here's the site as it is today. There's obviously been a little bit of reconstruction there in parts. You can see the remains of the walls, and as I say, a lot of it has been destroyed through the archaeology itself. So we don't really get a good sense of sort of the potential grandeur of it as well. In uncovering Troy, he found evidence of destruction by fire, which actually occurred several times, and he ended up digging up lots of artifacts, many of which correspond to details in the poem itself, like this helmet made of carved tusks, which corresponds to things that you can actually find in the poem, so that's fairly interesting. One day when they were digging, that he noticed something sticking out of the dirt, and he sent away all the workers, and he and his wife dug it out, and it was an enormous amount of gold, which he then had his wife wear and took a picture of her. It was very exciting. But the gold itself seemed to confirm his idea that this was the civilization that he was looking for. If we think about Bronze Age Troy, we do have to sort of set it apart in our minds from the sort of conventional image of the Greek warrior. So here's a picture on a vase from a much later period, and this is the traditional image we have of these round shields and the crested helmets with the sort of the bronze greaves on their legs. These are hoplites, and they're warriors who worked in formation from 5th century and later, and they're really quite different from the warriors as we imagine, as they were imagined in the Iliad and as they're represented in the Iliad. And if you want a sort of artistic representation of what the Bronze Age warriors look like that we're encountering, you have to turn to modern artistic representations, which are more like this. You can see there that the shields that correspond to the kind of shields that are described. That weird axe with the holes in it. That keep in mind. It'll become important as we get into the Odyssey. So there we have just a kind of an artistic representation. It will bring us back to the location of Troy. The other issue to think about is where the peoples described in this poem come from. If we start on the Achaean side, well, we have a number of heroes, famous characters like Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, Odysseus, Diomedes, Great Aias or Ajax, depends on your translation, and Little Aias. Here's where they come from. If you spread them out on the map, this is their hometowns. And we recognize from this that, of course, they are an alliance. They are a loose coalition run by Agamemnon as a kind of a warlord, and they owe obligations to him. But they're geographically connected. It's not an accident that they all come from this one location. There is a kind of a regional unity behind that particular coalition. And the Trojans, as it turns out, are not just people from the city of Troy. The Trojans actually have their own allies, and many of their fighting men come from another alliance. And here the names are not so famous because we're looking at names of whole people, like the Cacones and the Paeonians, the Carians, Lycians, Mysians. You'll get references to these when you meet individual characters: Thracians, Phrygians, Myonians. Here's where they come from, if we spread them out geographically. And when we look at this map, we can realize that the Trojan War itself is a much larger kind of regional conflict. It's not just a bunch of sort of local people getting together and going and sacking a single city in another place. This is a conflict not of cultures, because although there are different languages and you get hints of that in the poem, by and large these peoples are represented as fairly culturally similar. But we're still getting a kind of a regional conflict between large groups of people. And that's an important thing to remember.